5 minutes after the last camera flashes faded, Victoria Bellamy stood on the stage of the charity gala with a champagne flute in her hand, completely unaware that in just 10 seconds, a man in a gray suit would walk up behind her and quietly say her full name, followed by the word, "You're under arrest." She was still smiling at the audience, still smoothing her hair, still convinced the evening was her greatest triumph. But it had all begun very differently. I had worked for Belvedere Events for nearly 4 years. The company had been founded by Victoria, and she ran it personally, showing up at every major event in a perfectly tailored suit, with an icy stare and an uncanny ability to notice every tiny detail that failed to meet her standards of perfection. I carried serving trays, oversaw table settings, and sometimes coordinated entire banquet halls hosting up to 200 guests. I loved the job because it gave me the stability I'd never known growing up. My mother, Joan, raised me alone in a small apartment on the outskirts of Cleveland. We were never wealthy. Some nights dinner was nothing more than buttered pasta, and during the winter I wore a coat that was 2 sizes too big because we couldn't afford a new one. Mom worked as a janitor in 3 different buildings just to pay for my education. I still remember her hands, cracked, red from harsh cleaning chemicals, yet always warm when she stroked my hair before bed. When I got the job at Belvedere Events, I felt like I had finally escaped the life where every dollar had to be counted 3 times. The pay wasn't impressive, but it was steady, and after 2 years I was promoted to senior event coordinator. I rented a small apartment near downtown, saved money for my mother's medical treatment after she developed heart problems, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was in control of my own life. I was engaged to Daniel, a history professor at a local college. We met at one of the events I was organizing. He had been invited to give a lecture for a charitable foundation, while I spent the evening pouring coffee for the guests. During a break, he walked over and asked if I wanted a cup myself, since I'd been serving everyone else all night. I laughed for the first time in over a week. 2 years later we were engaged, and I truly believed my life was finally coming together the way I'd always dreamed. A steady career, a man who loved me, and a mother who was proud of me. Victoria Bellamy seemed like someone from another world. She wore watches that cost more than my annual salary, rode in a black Mercedes with a personal chauffeur, and spoke to the staff in short, clipped sentences, as though we existed solely to carry out her orders. Still, she was undeniably professional, and for the first 3 years I saw her as nothing more than a demanding boss. Only later did I realize how deeply mistaken I had been. Every spring, Belvedere Events organized a charity dinner benefiting the Cleveland Hope Foundation, a nonprofit that supported low-income families. It was the company's biggest event of the year, raising hundreds of thousands of dollars from the city's wealthiest donors. Victoria loved that evening more than any other because it guaranteed her appearance on the local news as the face of generosity. She personally invited reporters, posed beside oversized donation checks for photographs, and delivered heartfelt speeches about compassion for those who had been less fortunate. Behind the scenes, however, she was a very different person. A month before one of those galas, I watched a woman, one of the foundation's aid recipients, walk into the ballroom hoping to thank the organizers in person. She wore a simple dress that had obviously come from a clearance rack and nervously twisted the strap of her purse while waiting for someone to acknowledge her. Victoria looked at her, curled her lip in disgust, and said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "Who let this in? We're rehearsing for our real guests, not hosting a charity breakfast for beggars." The woman's face turned bright red, and she hurried out. I caught up with her in the hallway, apologized, and walked her to the exit. She quietly whispered, "I only wanted to say thank you. I guess I shouldn't have come." Those words stayed with me like a splinter I could never pull out. Scenes like that happened over and over again. Victoria mocked waiters for their accents and referred to the cleaning staff as invisible people who should stay invisible and keep quiet. One afternoon she forced a young kitchen worker to reset the same table 3 separate times. Then she dumped everything he'd done into the trash in front of everyone and said, "Maybe you should go back to wherever you came from. The standards are probably lower there." The young man was from Guatemala. He worked 2 jobs to support his family. He silently cleaned up the mess and disappeared into the storage room. Later I found him sitting alone on a supply crate, staring blankly at the wall that I never spoke up. My mother's mortgage depended on my paycheck. Her medications weren't cheap. Daniel and I were planning our wedding for the following year. I kept telling myself my responsibility was to take care of the guests and support the staff, not fight my boss. But every time I witnessed another humiliation, something inside me tightened, as though I were that woman in the inexpensive dress, the one being shown the door. Everything changed in March, 2 weeks before the next Cleveland Hope Foundation charity gala. I stayed late at the office one evening to finish the event budget. As part of my responsibilities as senior event coordinator, I reviewed the foundation's financial paperwork, matching vendor invoices against the budget allocated for each event. That night, I noticed something that didn't add up. The amount the foundation had transferred to cover the gala was nearly twice the actual cost of catering, ballroom rental, and decorations. The difference came to almost $80,000. At first I assumed I'd made a mistake. I checked the numbers again. They still didn't match. Then I opened the financial records from previous years. The same discrepancy appeared year after year. The only thing that changed was the size of the missing amount. It kept getting bigger. I didn't know what to do. Every report had been personally signed by Victoria, and all the paperwork went through her private accountant, Richard Haynes, a man who rarely came into the office and always kept to himself. Just in case, I made copies of several documents and saved them to my personal flash drive. I decided to speak with Victoria directly. Maybe it really was an accounting error, something simple that could easily be corrected. The next day I asked for a meeting. Victoria received me in her office without offering me a seat. "I don't have much time, Emily." "What is it?" "I found a discrepancy in the Cleveland Hope Foundation reports. For the past 3 years, the amounts the foundation has transferred for these events have been significantly higher than the actual expenses. I thought you should know." She was silent for several seconds. Something flashed across her face that I had never seen before. Not surprise. Calculation. "Your math is wrong," she finally said. "This is complicated accounting. You aren't expected to understand it. I've worked with these numbers for 4 years, Mrs. Bellamy. I'm not mistaken." She set her coffee cup down so hard that coffee splashed across her desk. "Are you accusing me of something?" "I'm saying we need to find out where the money donated for struggling families is actually going." She looked at me for a long moment. The room suddenly felt several degrees colder. "Leave the documents on my desk and go back to work," she said quietly. "And I suggest you forget this conversation ever happened." I walked out of her office with the unsettling feeling that I'd crossed an invisible line I'd never known existed. 3 days later, I was called into Human Resources. 2 men in business suits I had never seen before were waiting inside, along with an HR representative I didn't recognize. A folder with my name on it sat on the table. "Emily," the woman said without looking up, "we have reason to believe you've been embezzling company funds. We've discovered several suspicious transactions connected to your user account in our financial system." The blood drained from my face. My hands turned ice cold, and a metallic taste filled my mouth. "That's impossible. I've never taken a single cent from the company's accounts." One of the men slid a stack of printed documents across the table. They showed transfers totaling nearly $15,000, all made using my login credentials, sent to a bank account I'd never seen before. "These records have been fabricated," I said, my voice beginning to shake. "I didn't make those transfers." "We have the system logs, Emily," the second man replied coldly. "Every transaction was authorized using your password during business hours, while you were in the office." I tried to explain the discrepancies in the foundation's reports, to tell them about my conversation with Victoria 3 days earlier, but the woman from HR was already gathering paperwork, and the man in the suit, who I later learned was the company's attorney, recited the formal statement that I was being terminated for gross misconduct in violation of my employment agreement, and that the company was considering referring the matter to the police. They escorted me out of the building that same day. The security guard I'd known for 4 years looked away as he collected my ID badge. My coworkers watched from behind their computer screens, some with sympathy, others with poorly concealed curiosity. Not one of them said a word in my defense. A week later, I received a letter from the police informing me that I was under criminal investigation for embezzlement. 2 weeks after that, my bank froze my account pending the investigation because, as it turned out, transfers from the stolen funds had also been deposited into it. Money I knew absolutely nothing about, but that now tied my name to the crime. Daniel did his best to support me during those first few weeks. He believed me. He kept saying they would figure everything out, that the truth would come out. But little by little, I noticed something new in his eyes, not doubt about my innocence, but exhaustion from the constant strain. His colleagues at the college had started asking questions. His parents wondered whether he should really build a future with someone who had legal troubles. We broke up in May quietly without shouting. He simply said he needed time to think, and that time never seemed to end. My mother suffered another heart attack in June. The stress over my situation had made her condition worse. I sat in the hospital waiting room counting the cash in my wallet, knowing that with my bank account frozen, I couldn't even cover the insurance deductible. I borrowed money from my neighbor, the only person who still treated me like a human being. I couldn't find a job. Every prospective employer who checked my references discovered the pending criminal case, and every conversation ended with the polite, "We'll be in touch." I moved out of my apartment and into a spare room at my mother's house because I could no longer afford the rent. Night after night, I lay awake staring at the crack in the ceiling, convinced my life had ended at 32, even though I was technically still alive. One evening, while sorting through boxes of belongings I'd brought from my apartment, I came across that flash drive, the copies of the Foundation's documents I had made 3 days before I was fired. I plugged it into my mother's old laptop and opened the files again. The numbers stared back at me from the screen as coldly as Victoria had looked at me during our last conversation. I sat there for hours simply staring at the screen. And at some point, something inside me shifted. I stopped crying. I stopped replaying that conversation in her office over and over, trying to figure out what I'd said wrong. I realized one simple thing. I was done waiting for someone else to restore justice for me. I was going to create it myself. I closed the laptop, poured myself a cup of tea, and for the first time in months, I fell asleep without nightmares. The next morning, I started small. I made a list of everything I knew. The discrepancies in the Foundation's reports over the past 3 years. My conversation with Victoria and her reaction. The speed with which I'd been fired. Only 3 days between asking my question and being accused. The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. I knew I needed evidence that couldn't be dismissed as forged or written off as the revenge of a disgruntled former employee. I needed people who had seen what I had seen, and documents that had never passed through my hands. The first person I tracked down was Mariah Cooper, a former accounting employee at Belvedere Events who had resigned a year before I was fired, or so I had believed at the time. I found her through some old contacts, wrote her a letter, and explained everything honestly, without embellishment. We met at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. "I've been waiting for someone to come asking about this someday," she said, stirring a cup of coffee she never actually drank during our entire conversation. I left because Richard Haynes asked me to sign off on a report where the numbers didn't add up. I refused. A week later, they made it clear my position was no longer needed. "Do you still have any of the documents?" She was silent for a long time, staring out the window. "I have the draft reports I prepared before they were corrected for submission to the Foundation's board. I kept them because I never trusted those people from the very beginning. But I don't want trouble, Emily. I have 2 kids. I understand. But if we do nothing, she'll keep doing this to other people. She probably already is." Mariah studied me carefully, as if weighing how serious I really was. "Give me some time," she finally said, "and let me see whether those files are even still on my old hard drive." A week later, she wrote to tell me the files had survived. The draft reports showed the actual costs of the Foundation's charity events, figures that matched what I had found in my own copies, but did not match the final reports Victoria had presented to the board and to donors. The next person I found was an attorney, not an expensive lawyer from downtown, but Tom Wilkins, a specialist in nonprofit fraud cases who ran a small private practice in the suburbs and occasionally took cases pro bono if he believed they mattered. I found him through an online forum for people who had gone through situations similar to mine. We met in his tiny office, overflowing with file folders. "Tell me everything from the beginning," he said, leaning back in a creaky chair. "And don't leave out any details, even the ones that seem insignificant." So I told him everything. The discrepancies, my conversation with Victoria, being fired 3 days later, the criminal case against me. Tom listened in silence, taking notes in a legal pad. "You know what's strange about this whole story, Emily? Normally, when a company accuses an employee of embezzlement, they move carefully. They worry about being sued for defamation if the accusation turns out to be false. But this happened at lightning speed 3 days. That tells me someone was in a terrible hurry to silence you before you could dig any deeper. What should I do? For now, nothing reckless. We need evidence that will hold up in court, not just your word against hers. Do you still have the flash drive with the copied reports?" Yes. Good. Now we need to figure out exactly where that extra $80,000 a year was going. If Victoria was funneling foundation money into her own accounts or through shell companies, there should be a trail. People rarely pull off something like that perfectly. I spent the next 4 months like an archaeologist, methodically uncovering one layer after another. Tom helped me file a formal request through legal counsel for the Cleveland Hope Foundation's public tax filings. Nonprofit organizations are required to publish IRS Form 990, which lists major expenditures and significant recipients of funds. We identified several vendors that had been paid amounts far above the market rate for comparable services. One of those companies was called Greenfield Catering Solutions. It was registered to a man named Davis. I spent 2 weeks digging through the state's public business records before I found the connection. Davis was Victoria's cousin on her mother's side, and the company had been registered at an address belonging to the Bellamy family's country house. I showed the discovery to Tom over coffee in his office. "This is something," he said, studying the documents. "But we need more. A family connection alone isn't enough to prove intent. We need actual financial transactions showing that the foundation's money flowed through this company and ultimately back to Victoria herself." Impatience surged inside me. I wanted to act immediately, to do something, but I forced myself to stay calm. I remembered what Tom had told me at the very beginning. Patience is the only real weapon against people who are used to getting away with everything. As I gathered evidence, I learned about the other people Victoria had humiliated and exploited over the years. The young man from the kitchen, the one she had insulted in front of me, wasn't the only one. I tracked down a former florist who had worked with Belvedere Events 3 years earlier. Victoria had delayed payment for her services for 8 months, always with a different excuse, pushing the woman's business to the brink of bankruptcy. Then she hired another vendor, leaving the old invoices unpaid altogether. I tracked down the former driver Victoria had fired without severance pay because he arrived 5 minutes late after getting stuck in traffic caused by an accident that wasn't his fault. I also found the former nanny who had cared for Victoria's own children. The woman Victoria accused of stealing jewelry so she could avoid paying her for her final month of work. The jewelry later turned up in Victoria's own safe, but no apology ever came. Each story added another piece to the larger picture. Victoria Bellamy had built her life and reputation by exploiting people who lacked the resources to fight back. She had done it methodically for years, convinced that her social standing made her untouchable. "She doesn't think she's the villain," Mariah told me one day when we met again to review the documents. "I once overheard her talking to her husband. She genuinely believes she's just demanding high standards, and that people who can't meet those standards have only themselves to blame for their incompetence. She doesn't see any connection between herself and what happens to the people she fires." I recorded each of their statements, not for emotional satisfaction, but as potential witness testimony for the case that was slowly but steadily coming together. The real breakthrough came in September, 6 months after I was fired. Richard Haynes, Victoria's personal accountant, the same man who had pressured Mariah into signing the falsified report, left her under difficult circumstances. I learned about it by chance through an acquaintance who worked at the same accounting firm. After an internal audit, Victoria accused him of incompetence and fired him without severance, just as she had done to me and dozens of others. Tom Wilkins suggested we contact him. "People who've been betrayed by their former allies are often willing to talk," he said, "especially once they realize that staying silent no longer protects them." I wrote Richard a restrained letter. No accusations, just a request to meet and discuss our shared experience with Belvedere Events. He didn't respond for 2 weeks. Then one evening, late at night, he called me himself. His voice was tight with tension. "I know why you want to meet," he said without preamble. "I've been preparing for this conversation for 6 months, ever since I realized she'd do to me exactly what she'd done to everyone else the moment I stopped being useful." We met in Tom's office, so the conversation would take place in the presence of legal counsel and could be treated as an official statement. "I kept 2 sets of books under her direct instructions," Richard said, sitting across from us with his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had turned white. "The real financial records for the charity events and the public reports submitted to the Foundation's board and donors. The difference was funneled through shell companies registered under Victoria's relatives or trusted associates, and from there into her personal offshore accounts." "Do you have proof?" Tom asked. Richard pulled a hard drive out of his briefcase. I copied everything over the last 3 years. Insurance, in case she ever decided to get rid of me the same way she got rid of you. For the first time since the meeting began, he looked directly at me. I'm sorry about what happened to you, Emily. I knew the accusations against you were fabricated. On her orders, I processed those transfers in your name to explain the missing funds after you started asking questions. I did it because I was afraid of losing my job. But I don't want to be afraid anymore. The room seemed to freeze for a few seconds. I felt something inside me finally settle into place. Not relief, but a quiet, cold certainty. Thank you for telling the truth, I said softly. Richard's drive contained 3 years of financial records, email correspondence in which Victoria personally instructed him on how to disguise the transfers, and even a message she had sent on the day I was fired. Take care of the transfers into Emily Carter's account today. Everything needs to look believable by tomorrow morning. Tom spent the entire night reviewing the evidence. The next day he called me. This is enough, Emily. More than enough. We can take a charity fraud case to the district attorney and at the same time file a civil lawsuit on your behalf for defamation and malicious prosecution. But first, we need to clear your own criminal case. We have to get every charge against you dismissed before we go on the offensive. We submitted a motion to the prosecutor's office, including Richard's sworn statement, the financial records from the hard drive, and Mariah's evidence. 3 weeks later, after reviewing the material, the district attorney dismissed every charge against me. At the same time, the office announced the opening of a separate criminal investigation into Victoria Bellamy and the Cleveland Hope Foundation on suspicion of fraud and the misappropriation of charitable funds. But Tom insisted we couldn't stop with the criminal investigation alone. Criminal cases take months, sometimes years, before they ever reach trial, he said. Meanwhile, she'll keep showing up at charity galas, collecting donations, and destroying people's lives. The truth has to come out publicly, and it has to happen at a moment she can't control. That's when I remembered the Foundation's annual spring charity gala, the very event scheduled for the following month, the same event where I'd first discovered the discrepancies in the financial records a year earlier. Victoria had never canceled it, not even while under investigation. Canceling would have looked like an admission of guilt, and she was far too convinced of her own invincibility to allow that. I shared the plan I'd been thinking about for weeks. She'll be standing on stage in front of donors, reporters, and the Foundation's board, giving a speech about compassion and generosity. If the truth comes out at that exact moment, in front of everyone she's been deceiving for years, she won't be able to control the narrative. She won't have time to prepare excuses. Tom listened carefully. It's risky. Everything has to be legally flawless. No insinuations. No unsupported accusations in public. Only facts backed by documents and law enforcement officers ready to act immediately. We contacted the assistant district attorney handling Victoria's case. After learning about the upcoming event and reviewing the volume of evidence we'd collected, he agreed that the moment Victoria personally solicited donations in front of hundreds of witnesses, including reporters from the local television stations, would be the ideal opportunity to file formal charges publicly, without warning, before she had any chance to hide assets or flee. The final month before the gala was filled with constant tension. Tom and I coordinated with the prosecutor's office, gathered the last pieces of supporting documentation, and helped Mariah and Richard prepare for their official testimony. I also met with Lauren Diaz, an investigative reporter for a local television station who had previously covered suspicious financial reporting by nonprofit organizations in the city. Without compromising the investigation, I gave her publicly available documents, including the Foundation's IRS Form 990, which contained obvious inconsistencies, so she could prepare her story and attend the event with a camera crew. The night of the gala finally arrived. The ballroom of the same hotel where dozens of similar events had been held during my years with Belvedere events glittered beneath crystal chandeliers, every table dressed in crisp white linens. I stood quietly among the invited guests. Tom had insisted that I attend in person, as one of the victims and as a key witness whose name had now been officially cleared of every accusation. Victoria entered wearing a dark navy gown, as flawless as ever, greeting guests with the polished smile she'd perfected over the years. She delivered her opening remarks about the importance of helping those less fortunate, about the values that Belvedere Events and the Cleveland Hope Foundation had brought to the community for 15 years. The audience applauded. My heart began to race when I noticed several people in dark suits appear quietly at the far end of the ballroom. The district attorney's investigators, Tom, had alerted in advance. They remained discreet, waiting for the signal. Victoria stepped forward for the evening's centerpiece. The ceremonial presentation of the oversized donation check, the most photographed moment of the event. She took the microphone, smiled toward the cameras, and said, "Tonight, we've raised a record amount for the families who need it most." It was at that exact moment that the detective approached the stage, accompanied by the district attorney. The room fell silent as the prosecutor stepped forward, introduced himself to the audience, and made an official statement announcing that Victoria Bellamy was being charged with fraud, embezzlement of nonprofit funds on a particularly large scale, and falsifying financial records over a period of at least 3 years. Victoria's smile froze on her face like a mask that suddenly no longer matched the expression in her eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but couldn't find the words. Lauren Diaz's cameras captured every second. "There has to be some mistake," she finally said, her voice trembling for the first time in all the years I had known her. "I don't understand what you're talking about. Mrs. Bellamy, we have sufficient probable cause to place you under arrest," the detective said calmly as he pulled out a pair of handcuffs. The ballroom erupted into whispers. Phone cameras flashed. Some of the guests immediately began recording the scene. I stood off to the side, watching as the woman who had once thrown a poor guest out the door while sneering about beggars, now stood before hundreds of people helpless, with handcuffs around her wrists. She searched the crowd looking for someone, perhaps for support, perhaps for an explanation, and her eyes found mine. For a moment, we simply stared at each other across the ballroom. I wasn't smiling. I wasn't celebrating. I was simply watching everything she had built on other people's humiliation collapse before her. "You," she mouthed silently, recognizing me. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The truth had already spoken for me. The detectives escorted her out of the ballroom to the relentless clicking of cameras, past tables covered with half-eaten desserts and half-finished glasses of champagne. The foundation's board of directors gathered in a private room in a panic, trying to grasp the full scope of the disaster. Reporters were already writing breaking stories for the morning news. Later that evening, I left the hotel with Tom. The air was cool, carrying the scent of early spring. "Well," he said quietly, "now the real work begins. Civil lawsuits, possible asset forfeiture, compensation for everyone who was harmed." "I know," I replied. But today was enough. The following months brought an avalanche of consequences that Victoria had clearly never imagined. The investigation that began with my case uncovered the true scale of her operation. In addition to the Cleveland Hope Foundation, she had used similar schemes at 2 other charities that worked with her company. Altogether, more than $2 million had been stolen over the years. Victoria's husband, Harold Bellamy, filed for divorce 3 weeks after her arrest, not so much out of moral conviction as because his attorneys warned him that remaining married could expose his own assets, accumulated during their marriage, to court-ordered recovery. He released a brief statement to the local press claiming that he had no knowledge of his wife's business practices, a claim few people believed, considering he had personally served on the foundation's board of directors. Belvedere Events declared bankruptcy 2 months later after clients began canceling contracts en masse and banks froze the company's accounts as part of the investigation. Hundreds of employees lost their jobs, but unlike me, they walked away without criminal accusations hanging over their heads. They simply had to look for new work. It struck me as a bitter but fitting irony. A company built on exploiting ordinary people had finally collapsed, taking down everyone who had depended on it. The Bellamy's home in an upscale neighborhood was listed for sale to cover legal expenses and victim restitution. I learned about it from Mariah, who was once again working as an accountant, this time for a different company. She had openly testified as a key witness, and somehow that honesty had strengthened rather than damaged her professional reputation. The trial began 8 months later. I spent 3 days on the witness stand, telling the jury everything. The conversation in Victoria's office, being fired 3 days later, the 6 months I lived under suspicion while my mother fought for her life in the hospital, and I counted the last few dollars in my wallet. Victoria sat at the defense table wearing a plain gray suit, with no jewelry and no makeup. The woman I had known seemed to have disappeared, leaving behind only a tired, frightened figure who avoided looking in my direction. Richard and Mariah testified as well. So did the florist, the driver, and the former nanny. Each told their own story, and as I listened, I realized just how deliberately and methodically Victoria had built her power on the silence of people she considered beneath her notice. The verdict was delivered at the end of November. 8 years in prison for large-scale fraud, embezzlement of nonprofit funds, and falsifying financial records, along with full restitution to every victim, including me. While delivering the sentence, the judge made a point of noting that the defendant had used her position not only for personal enrichment, but also to systematically intimidate and exploit people who lacked the resources to defend themselves. A description that, to me, captured more accurately than anything else what I had witnessed over 4 years. Victoria never looked at me as she was led out of the courtroom. Perhaps she never fully understood what had happened. Perhaps, somewhere deep inside, she still believed she was the victim of circumstance rather than the person who had spent years destroying other people's lives for the sake of her own comfort. Nearly 2 years have passed since the night she was led away from that charity gala in handcuffs. My mother recovered from the heart surgery we were finally able to afford thanks to the court-ordered compensation. She takes morning walks in the park near our home again. Sometimes I watch her and remember that winter when I counted spare change in the hospital waiting room, and I realize how far we've come. I opened my own small catering company specializing in charity events. But from the very beginning, I established one firm rule. A portion of the profit from every major event goes directly to a fund that helps hospitality workers facing financial hardship. Mariah manages my books, and together we review every financial statement twice, because trust is something that's easy to lose and painfully difficult to rebuild. Richard moved to another state and found a job at a small firm where, as he puts it, he can finally sleep peacefully again. We exchange messages from time to time, although the shadow of those transfers he processed in my name under someone else's orders will always remain between us. I forgave him, but I never forgot. The florist whose business nearly failed because of unpaid invoices received compensation and reopened her shop. I became one of her very first customers when I launched my catering company. Daniel sent me a short message about a year after the trial, apologizing for not standing by me when I needed him most. I replied politely and wished him well. Some doors, once closed, should never be opened again. Not out of anger, but because trust shattered at the hardest moment rarely fits back together without leaving visible cracks. Sometimes I walk past the very hotel where that charity gala took place. The building still stands exactly where it always has, hosting weddings and corporate events as though nothing had ever happened within its walls. But I know what happened there. And I know that somewhere in the archives of the local news stations, the footage still exists. The moment when the woman who had spent years humiliating anyone she considered beneath her stood on that stage with handcuffs around her wrists while the entire room watched her in silence, just as she had once looked at a poor woman wearing a cheap dress. I no longer think of revenge as something I needed to prove to the world. I think of it as the one thing that finally allowed me to breathe again. The truth doesn't always win on its own. Sometimes it has to be uncovered, documented, and presented at exactly the right moment, to exactly the right people. But when that happens, it can change everything. Sometimes my mother asks whether there's any bitterness left in me after everything we've been through. I answer her honestly. The bitterness disappeared the day I heard the judge read the sentence. What remained was the quiet strength of someone who walked through the fire and came out the other side not broken, but tempered, and who knows with absolute certainty that she will never again allow anyone to look down on her as though she were worth less than they are.